It is instead just to get money out of nations that are a little bit more controlling over people's fortunes. Most notably, China. Riding high on the coattails of the economic miracle, China is now home to more billionaires than any other nation on Earth. But all is not necessarily well for these cashed-up communists. There are severe limitations imposed on what these people can do with their money, and the ever-present threat of being disappeared if you somehow fall out of line. What this means is that these billionaires want to get their money out of the country and into a bank account in a nation that is more accepting of rich people and their flagrant violation of the law. The problem is that China has seen this happening, and it's a really, really bad problem for them for two reasons. The first is that if people can get their money out of the country, it means that they will no longer be brought to justice for any crimes that they have committed inside the nation that made them rich. Like say, I don't know, corruption for example. Now the arguments for or against the war on corruption are obviously very, very controversial, but that's not even the most important point here. Justice takes a distant second place to the issue of capital flight. If millionaires and billionaires are sending all of their money overseas, it means that that money is not staying in your country to be invested into making the nation a wealthier place. This has been particularly apparent in nations like South Africa, that basically saw a majority of its upper class pack up and move abroad, bringing all of their money with them. Now China really does not want a repeat of this whole mess, so they have set severe limitations on the amount of Chinese RMB that can be exchanged for other currencies in a given year. No individual can exchange more than the equivalent of 50,000 US dollars worth of Chinese currency in a given calendar year. Which, as a quick side note, it must be recognised how distorted the market for Chinese RMB is, given that they literally set federal laws denoted in US dollars rather than in their own currency. But anyway, the takeaway here is that $50,000 a year is not a lot. If you are trying to move $1 billion, that's going to take you more than like 3 years to do. In all seriousness though, if you want to offshore your funds in less than 1,000 years or so, you are going to need to speed things up a little bit. So what you do instead is this. Run your money through a casino. Fortunately for you, Macau is conveniently right next door in its own special economic zone. This city is the largest gambling centre in the world, handily beating out Las Vegas, which comes in a distant second place. But the problem still kind of stands. You still can't take your money out of China to use in these casinos, but what you can do instead is this. Pay a travel agent $100 million for an all-inclusive package holiday. Sounds pretty steep, right? But wait till you hear the inclusions. A private jet flight to Macau, a massive private hotel suite, all the Portuguese egg tarts you could eat, and included in this package just so happens to be $100 million worth of poker chips. How convenient. Now you can have a grand old time playing cards with these chips, but you just have to use them at least once. So you play a few hands of Baccarat, you win some, you lose some, and eventually you're probably going to come out with more or less what you started with. If you break down your bets into $1 million hands each, and you play 100 hands, you are likely to win about 49 out of the 100, which means that you'll walk away with about $98 million.
The House of Morgan. An American Banking Dynasty and the Rise of Modern Finance Prologue. This book is about the rise, fall, and resurrection of an American banking empire, the House of Morgan. Perhaps no other institution has been so encrusted with legend, so ripe with mystery, or exposed to such bitter polemics. Until 1989, J.P. Morgan and Company solemnly presided over American finance from the corner of Broad and Wall. Flanked by the New York Stock Exchange and Federal Hall, the short building at 23 Wall Street with its unmarked cater corner entrance exhibited a patrician aloofness. Much of our story revolves around this chiseled marble building and the presidents and prime ministers, moguls and millionaires who marched up its steps. With the records now available, we can follow them inside the world's most secretive bank. The old pre-1935 House of Morgan was probably the most formidable financial combine in history. Started by an American banker, George Peabody, in London in 1838, it was inherited by the Morgan family and transplanted to New York to famous effect. In the popular mind, the two most familiar Morgans, J.P. Morgan Sr. (1837–1913) and J.P. Morgan Jr. (1867–1943) are rolled into a composite beast, J.P. Morgan, that somehow endured for more than a century. Their striking physical resemblance, the bald pate, the bulbous nose, the pear-shaped frame, has only fed confusion. For admirers, these two J.P. Morgans typified the sound, old-fashioned banker whose word was his bond and who sealed his deals with a handshake. Detractors saw them as hypocritical tyrants who bullied companies, conspired with foreign powers and coaxed America into war for profit. Nobody was ever neutral about the Morgans. Before the Depression, 23 Wall was headquarters of an empire with several foreign outposts. Seated behind roll-top desks on the Broad Street side, the New York partners were allied with three other partnerships: Morgan Grenfell in London, Morgan et Compagnie in Paris, and Drexel and Company, the so-called Philadelphia branch of J.P. Morgan. Of these, Morgan Grenfell was easily the most powerful, forming the central London-New York axis of the Morgan Empire. It was a transatlantic post office for British and American state secrets. Before the New Deal, the term House of Morgan applied a third of J.P. Morgan and Company in New York, or, more broadly, to the whole shadowy web of partnerships. The old House of Morgan spawned 1,000 conspiracy theories and busy generations of muckrakers. As the most Mandarin of banks, it catered to many prominent families, including the Astors, Guggenheims, DuPonts, and Vanderbilts. It shunned dealings with lesser mortals, thus breeding popular suspicion. Since it financed many industrial giants, including U.S. Steel, General Electric, General Motors, DuPont, and American Telephone and Telegraph, it entered into their councils and aroused fear of undue banker power. The early House of Morgan was something of a cross between a central bank and a private bank. It stopped panics, saved the gold standard, rescued New York City 3 times, and arbitrated financial disputes. If its concerns transcended an exclusive desire for profit, it also had a peculiar knack for making good works pay. What gave the House of Morgan its tantalizing mystery was its government links. Much like the old Rothschilds and Barings, it seemed insinuated into the power structure of many countries, especially the United States, England, and France, and, to a lesser degree, Italy, Belgium, and Japan. As an instrument of U.S. power abroad, its actions were often endowed with broad significance in terms of foreign policy. At a time when a parochial America looked inward, the bank's ties abroad, especially those with the British crown, gave it an ambiguous character and raised questions about its national loyalties. The old Morgan partners were financial ambassadors whose daily business was often closely intertwined with affairs of state. Even today, J.P. Morgan and Company is probably closer to the world's central banks than any other bank. This empire was shattered by the Glass-Steagall Act of 1933, which erected a high wall between commercial banking, making loans and accepting deposits, and investment banking, issuing stocks and bonds. In 1935, J.P. Morgan and Company chose to remain a commercial bank and spun off Morgan Stanley, an investment house. Seated with J.P. Morgan capital and personnel, Morgan Stanley for decades clearly exhibited common ancestry with its Morgan brother down the block. They shared many clients and kept alive a family feeling no less potent for its informality. Glass-Steagall didn't bar J.P. Morgan from holding a minority stake in an overseas securities house, however. Until 1981, it kept a 1/3 interest in Morgan Grenfell. As our story will show, the three Morgan houses functioned as a de facto House of Morgan long after the New Deal ended, and in the early 1970s even contemplated reunion.
Which I am sure some of the more discerning viewers will note is less than what you started with, but that's okay, because suddenly you have generated $98 million worth of revenue in Macau, which is conveniently just outside of China. When your vacation is over, the casino will ask you how you want to settle your chips, and most people will answer in US dollars, please. So there you go. Congratulations, you have circumvented the $50,000 limitation. Well done. 2 side notes that are incredibly interesting here. The first is that casino poker chips are basically a fixed price currency, in every sense of the word. They have a denoted value, which people respect because they believe the underlying institution to honour the value of the currency, and it's effectively transferable, even in extreme situations like the one we just mentioned. This is a completely irrelevant factoid to the process of moving your money about, but still pretty cool to think about. The second side note is more of a question, and it's why on earth is China letting this happen? They are a hugely powerful nation, and Macau is effectively under their control. Why on earth don't they just put a stop to this? Well, partially, it's because of publicity. Macau isn't the largest gambling centre in the world because it's somehow more attractive than Vegas. It got to where it is today on the back of mega gamblers moving huge sums of money around the world. Think of their casinos more as investment banks with slightly tackier lobbies. If China stamped out this industry, the region would lose a lot of this prosperity, which is a bad look for a region, that has just fallen under Chinese rule, especially when China is in the process of trying to convince other microstates to join their ranks. Smashing through Macau's primary industry might just send a message to all of those denizens in Hong Kong or whatever to protest just that little bit harder. The second thing here is that China kind of has locked it down. This process still happens, but it's far, far more difficult than it was just a few years ago, so people are having to go further abroad, to places like Vegas or Australia. I mean, it's a little bit further to travel, but they do fall outside of the direct scrutiny of the government, and hey, you know what? Maybe while you're there you can pick up a Britney Spears concert or go nuke a wombat. Whatever gets you ready for a night at the high limit tables, I guess. Anyway, now you have your money out, it's time to put it to good use. And for this, you're going to have to find yourself a good investment banker. So you have your money out of wherever it is that you are trying to get your money out of, and it's all sitting there in a lovely world reserve currency like US dollars. It's time to start putting this money to work. You are going to want your money to make more money, which means investing. You are going to want your money to be safe, which means investing into a developed and very secure country, and you are probably not going to want to pay taxes, which means you are going to need a nice portfolio of offshore tax havens. And the best place to get all of that in one convenient location is probably London. Go watch our video on the economy of the UK for more on that one. But how do you actually structure this? Well, it all gets extremely complex, so stay with me here. The first thing you want to do is find a nice, stable investment portfolio. Go buy up some shares or an unbelievably expensive flat in inner London. It's all good, it doesn't matter, so long as it's nice and stable. Then what you do is effectively put a mortgage on that property, but not a mortgage like any mere mortal would apply for. What you do is call your private banker and ask for an equity line of credit, or ELOC for short.
Today, for the first time, the three houses lack formal links and are engaged in fierce rivalry. As deregulation in London and New York has dismantled old regulatory barriers, the three increasingly clash as they sell competing services. While people know the Morgan houses by name, they are often mystified by their business. They practice a brand of banking that has little resemblance to standard retail banking. These banks have no telecages, issue no consumer loans, and grant no mortgages. Rather, they perpetuate an ancient European tradition of wholesale banking, serving governments, large corporations, and rich individuals. As practitioners of high finance, they cultivate a discreet style. They avoid branches, seldom hang out signposts, and, until recently, wouldn't advertise. Their strategy was to make clients feel accepted into a private club, as if a Morgan account were a membership card to the aristocracy. The true heir to the old House of Morgan is J.P. Morgan and Company, also known by the name of its bank subsidiary, Morgan Guaranty Trust. A universe away from the coarse bustle of Chase Manhattan or Citibank, it seduces the rich with leather armchairs, grandfather clocks, and polished brass lamps. In private dining rooms, anniversaries of accounts are celebrated, with customers receiving engraved menus as souvenirs. The bank won't soil its white gloves with just anybody's cash, and many depositors bring along corporate connections. Although the bank is bashful about revealing precise figures, it prefers personal accounts of at least $5 million and will occasionally stoop as low as $2 million as a favor. The Morgan Bank is the foremost repository of old American money. While private accounts give Morgan its glamorous cachet, they generate only a small fraction of the profits. The bank concentrates on blue-chip corporations and governments, organizing large credits and securities issues and trading foreign exchange and other instruments. The Morgan Bank used to boast that 96 of America's 100 largest corporations were clients, and hinted that in 2 of the remaining cases, it had blackballed the companies as unfit. As with personal accounts, it never wanted to appear too eager for business. Instead of setting up offices hither and yon, it preferred to have clients make pilgrimages to it. This rule applied to its outposts abroad as well. A Lyons businessman would travel to Paris, a Midlands businessman to London, to see his Morgan banker. Even in today's far more competitive world, there is seldom more than one J.P. Morgan office in a country. For more than a century, this traditional formula, reworked many times, has paid off handsomely. On the eve of the 1987 crash, J.P. Morgan and Company was America's most expensive bank, even though only the 4th largest. Based on its share price, it would have cost $8.5 billion to buy, or more than Citigroup. Although beleaguered by over $4 billion of Latin American debt, J.P. Morgan's subsidiary bank, Morgan Guaranty, was America's only major bank to boast a AAA rating. For most of the 1980s, it had the highest return on equity of any bank, often ranking second in profits only to Citigroup, and with only half its assets. As the nation's premier trust bank, it managed $65 billion in securities on Black Monday 1987. It has been praised as first in quality by about any measure you can think of, and for many the perfect bank. Although a fair share of blunders and isolated scandals have undercut the hyperbole, the judgments remain generally valid. At least until it swept into hostile takeovers in the late 1980s, Morgan Guaranty best retained the historic Morgan culture of gentlemanly propriety and conservative dealings. As confidant of the Federal Reserve and other central banks, it still exhibits vestiges of its old statesman's role. Morgan Stanley, in contrast, has wandered furthest from its roots. From 1935 through the 1970s, it enjoyed a reign such as no investment bank will ever match. Its clients included 6 of the 7 sister oil companies, Gulf Oil being the exception, and 7 of America's 10 largest companies. Such success led to storied arrogance, a comic vanity. When one partner left for First Boston in the mid-1970s, he was congratulated by another. That's really exciting. Now you'll be dealing with the second best list of clients. Indeed, the client rosters of any 2 competitors together couldn't have touched Morgan Stanley's. When the firm started advertising in the 1970s, an agency created a sketch of a thunderbolt piercing a cloud, with the caption, "If God wanted to do financing, he would call Morgan Stanley." For Morgan Stanley partners, this neatly summarized their place in the cosmos. Asked at the 1988 annual meeting about the firm's policy of serving on non-client boards, Chairman S. Parker Gilbert paused thoughtfully and replied, "We have no non-clients."
You may have heard the term HELOC loan before, and it's basically the same thing. It's just on your home, rather than any random asset out there. Now, since you are worth $98 million after your soiree in Macau, you are going into an extremely low-risk category in the bank's eyes. So the terms you get for this loan are amazing. For example, Mark Zuckerberg famously pays 1% interest on his line of credit for his home in California. But of course, you didn't actually need this loan to buy your investment. You had enough cash to pay for this outright. But what this does instead is effectively act like a giant credit card. A major investment bank like HSBC, Barclays, Credit Suisse or whatever would probably give you a $50 million ELOC on a stable asset like a diverse share portfolio. And that means if you ever want to buy a super yacht or a politician or a villa in France, you can do that without having to sell your underlying asset, which is that share portfolio. An ELOC is basically like renting a bank account that you put your shares down as security against. People often ask where billionaires keep their cash. The answer is, they don't. They have assets with lines of credit on them which they can use for their day-to-day expenses. Because these positions are so secure, these individuals barely pay any interest on them. So even if their actions were not nefarious, it would just be foolish to structure your finances in any other way. Fortunately for you, dear billionaire with a questionable background, it also means that you now have the ability to spend your money wherever it is that your chosen investment bank operates, which is pretty much anywhere you are going to be hanging out. So, yippee, you have ticked all of your boxes. Your money is safe, parked in assets held in the most secure financial center in the world. You are earning a good return, so long as you have chosen decent assets. If your private banker is worth their salt, you won't be paying any tax on it. And best of all, you can conjure up cash wherever you need at a moment's notice. I mean, how good is the banking system when you are super rich? But wait, there's more. Let's say you use your entire line of credit to buy a super yacht. Probably not the most responsible purchase, but whatever. YOLO, right? Well, it's not all bad. Suddenly, you now have an extra $50 million asset. And guess what? You can put another ELOC against that. Again, the bank may only give you 50% of the underlying value of the asset to draw down on, but that's okay. It's still another $25 million that you can get at a 1% interest rate. Ever noticed how all of the world's mega yachts have Georgetown written on the back of them? Well, Georgetown is a city in the Cayman Islands. The Cayman Islands are a territory of the City of London, where most of these banks are based. Even besides the generous tax allowances, registering your yacht in the Cayman Islands makes it really easy to get a loan on. The world of high finance is unbelievably complex and intentionally opaque. The system ultimately revolves around moving money from its lucrative origins to a more stable and useful home base. Is it always nefarious? Well, no, it actually very rarely is. The banking systems that are in place to accommodate the needs of the world's billionaires today are modelled around making intelligent capital work in intelligent ways. But it just so happens that people with ulterior motives can get lost in the mix of things, which is basically the way that regular old money laundering works. In the same way that mob bosses of yesteryear would layer their cash amongst revenue from their laundromats or car washes or whatever, the destitute billionaires of today can use all manner of financial instruments to live the high life that they have earned.
We spotted a suspect trading pattern. All three firms have links to Bobby Axelrod.
Everyone has access to the information. We just know how to analyze it better.
Bobby Axelrod is guilty, and I am determined to check that.
But you have a conflict of interest in your own home.
For some reason, I can't keep doing my job.
Still trust her? I want to. They've opened a case file on you. You can't afford a mark in the loss column.
Walk away.